My name is David Danzilio, and this is 200,000 lines later. It's about our journey to manageable Puppet code. So who am I is probably a good question. There we go. All right, that's me. I am a Puppet evangelist at Constant Contact. Not entirely sure what that means. I'm a systems engineer, and I have a lot of a lot of background in Puppet. So they brought me on to sort of help lead their Puppet implementation. I joined there in 2014, the beginning of 2014, and I have sort of an interesting background. I started using Puppet around 2009. I can't exactly remember the version, but it was the 20.24 series. I think it was .24.6. Anybody here beat me on that? No? Oh, all right, we got one. Okay. Two? Okay, cool. So you guys are going to see a lot of stuff here that you're going to remember. So this is my second time speaking at PuppetConf. I guess they didn't learn the first time. Yeah, my background is, I have a lot of background in large enterprises, healthcare, government, IT, research. Now I'm in web operations. I like to think, I'm not that great of an engineer. My background isn't in engineering. I have a political science degree and a business degree. So, but I'm really good at talking about being a good engineer. So that's kind of what makes me a good evangelist. So, if you guys are, sorry, there we go. These are my modules on the Forge. If you use them, that's great. I'm glad. So what is Constant Contact? If you listen to NPR, you've probably heard about us. We sponsor like every local NPR station in the world. So we make tools that help small businesses do more business. And that's a fancy marketing way to say that we send email and do social media marketing and stuff like that. But we target really small businesses, Main Street type of businesses who don't have marketing departments. So we were founded in 1995. We're headquartered in Waltham, Massachusetts, which is a suburb just a hop, skip, and a jump away from Boston. In 2003, we switched from an on-premise to a SaaS model. We moved from Windows to Linux around 2005. We started on CentOS 5, but don't ask me how much of that we have around. So we've got some scale. We're not the biggest company here by far, but we're solidly in the large enterprise category. We have offices in San Francisco, New York City, London, among other less desirable places. We have about 1,500 employees, 350 to 400 developers. That includes QE folks, and about 70 ops. We have about 160 plus deployable applications. We were using service-oriented architecture before it was cool or called microservices. And we're hiring, so if any of this sounds interesting to you, let me know. We're hiring specifically for ops people in San Francisco and Waltham. So as far as scale goes, we have about 4,000 physical nodes. We have that's in 5 environments across 3 data centers. We also have a large and growing OpenStack infrastructure. And we're kind of a bit of a paradox. On one hand, we still rely on DB2 for some of our core business applications, but at the same time, we also have one of the largest production deployments of Cassandra. So we have a lot of legacy stuff alongside a lot of newer stuff. We adopted Cassandra really early too. That's sort of a theme for us. So you're probably interested in what this talk is about. I'm going to talk about our environment and our challenges, our successes and failures and lessons from trying to transform how Puppet is used in a large enterprise, and sort of my plans for achieving the Puppet singularity. And I'm going to talk about my quest to understand and affect change in a massively complex organization. So the reason when you come to PuppetConf, you're around some like insanely talented people, and many of the people speaking are sort of the rock stars. They're the type of people who've really kind of figured that out, and they make things look easy. So I really wanted to give a talk to remind people not every environment is easy, but our experience is really valuable, so I wanted to share that with people. If the only thing you take away from this presentation is a healthy dose of Schadenfreude, that's fine, but but I hope this will help some people realize that they're not alone. So the TLDR here is that, oh no. Oh man, okay, I can only go forward for some reason. Scaling Puppet is hard, but it's not hard for any technical reason. The tech is actually pretty easy. Scaling Puppet really is scaling, a web application, and we just happen to be pretty good at that. So it's really about, the challenges with people, and that's sort of my biggest problem is how do I get all my developers to do certain things one way, and so we'll go into that. But like I said, Puppet was an early adopter, or Constant Contact was an earlier adopter of Puppet. Around 2009, which was when I started using Puppet myself, they started with version 2.4.8. You name the bug, we've seen it. We've seen it multiple times, probably. The Forge didn't exist, so we had to write everything. And it was pretty hard. Puppet talent was, and still is, really hard to find. And writing Puppet was kind of hard, pretty hard back then. Puppet back then really sucked, but it was way better than the alternative, which was, doing everything by hand. And so, let's see, this slide here, I don't even think Puppet maintains it. Sorry, it's so hard to see, but I had to fit it on the slide. This is like a comparison of the features and sort of the major versions of Puppet. So if you take a look, the .2.4 series was missing some things like parameterized classes, missing, let's see, hashes, regular expressions. So it was pretty bare bones back then. I don't even think Puppet maintains this chart anymore. It looks like it dropped off at the 3.4 series, but I guarantee this is a much bigger table today. So unfortunately, a lot of the code we wrote back then is still around in one form or another. The company was growing so fast, and nobody really had time to sort of focus on Puppet. For a while, and ops sort of mandated that everything had to be done in Puppet. If you're doing any configuration whatsoever, it has to be in code, because we knew that we were going to have to scale up very quickly, and we didn't want to have to deal with messy things like backups and state and stuff like that. So we adopted a sort of an immutable infrastructure, or the beginnings of an immutable infrastructure mentality pretty early. And for a while, there was a lot of pushback on that. For a while, Puppet was kind of a dirty word, and just about any problem was attributed to Puppet. So if your application wouldn't start, that clearly had to be Puppet. If your hard drive died, that was definitely Puppet. If you had a bad commute in the morning, it was Puppet. Things are a lot better today. But we're still fighting a lot of battles. But Puppet is the accepted solution. So that brings me to my slide about the good. This means that everything is in Puppet. Just about everything in our environment can be described with code, and that's usually Puppet. For us, it's not done unless it's Puppetized. So this alone is a huge thing. This is still a pipe dream for a lot of organizations. And because it's in code, it's also in Git. So our entire environment is version controlled. That's alone is huge. So I wanted to start out my presentation making note of that fact. So our infrastructure is built to be ephemeral as best as possible. Obviously, things that need state, like databases and stuff like that, are backed up. But our servers are meant to be disposable. Something dies, we don't troubleshoot it. We just provision a new one, and that's pretty great. And being able to do that, we started with very simple commodity hardware, one-use servers for everything. A single power supply. We wanted to be able to swap things out really quickly, and we got really good at provisioning physical nodes, and we can provision a physical machine just about as fast as we can provision a virtual machine now. And because everything's in Puppet, moving apps to OpenStack is just running Puppet on a virtual machine. It's great. So the bad. When I got to Constant Contact, the reason they were looking for somebody with this kind of experience was they needed help getting off of Puppet 2.7. We're stuck on our sort of production version of Puppet is Puppet 2.7.3, which was really buggy and slow. Lots of the code was written before parameterized classes, and if you don't know what that looks like, I'll show you in a few minutes. And one of the things I realized pretty quickly was that if you have any doubt about the truth of Conway's law, come work at Constant Contact. There was a lot of design by copy and paste, which is a lot like a game of telephone. You lose fidelity with each hop. Most of our code, our primary Puppet repository, lives in a single Git repo, and there are a lot of other problems with that too, but I won't go into that. Testing is sort of up to the developer, so if they make a change, it's expected that they have tested it somehow, but there are no controls to make sure that that assumption is true. We do a parser validate on the code that people check into the repo, but a lot of times people just push it to the repo, so that doesn't help a whole lot. There was really no design beyond the initial implementation. Most of the code evolved organically, and I will note that the initial design was done hand in hand with Puppet Labs. And so what we started out with was the best practice at the time. So it didn't stay the best practice, and that's the problem. We have a bit of a propensity for homegrown solutions, and a habit really for only sort of thinking in terms of the current use case. And that's something that I have to deal with a lot. So the ugly, massive code base. I'm going to show you just how massive in a second. The amount of complexity is unparalleled. When I started at Constant Contact, I looked at the code and I didn't know. I had been reading and writing Puppet code for years, and I could not make sense of this junk. The code base is incredibly tightly coupled, and that even is an understatement. There are very few tests, and I would say effectively none. There is very little documentation, and it's way, way too easy to get into production. So this alone is sort of the nightmare, or what nightmares are made of for some of us ops folks. Yet, our product is still great. We have great uptime, and it works. So I definitely have to take this with that in mind. We have a hard time with dependencies, so we really only say there's you get to use this and that's it. So that's how we manage dependencies, by saying that we give a list of these modules and that's how you have to use them. If you need a new feature, then well, sorry. The pipeline to production is relatively ambiguous. None of the Puppet monolith code is versioned. We have two deployed branches, production and release, or development and release. So obviously you develop on development, and pre-prod points to that branch, and then stage, prod, and DR point at the release branch. And at a certain point, the development branch just gets merged into the release branch. So I took a snapshot. This is from our GitHub instance. This is what our Puppet code looks like. Some quick stats, almost 80,000 commits, 116 branches, 93 releases, and 206 contributors. Does anybody here work in an environment like this, with this many people committing? That's good. Probably want to hire you. So this is what our code looks like. I took this from the count lines of code utility. This represents the 471 modules in our primary Puppet repo. So we started breaking our code out into separate repos. So this isn't even all of it. Between manifest, plugins, and templates, we have over 365,000 lines of code. That's about 24 lines per manifest. Oh, by the way, this is after cutting 200,000 lines of code just in the past year and a half. So, for some perspective, let's see. This is what Puppet itself looks like. We have more code than Puppet. So let's dig in a little bit. I gave you a little bit of an overview. Trust me, it's not all that bad. It looks pretty bad, but so like I said, I joined in February 2014, and I was pretty confident we'd be able to get to Puppet 3 by the end of 2014, and I was really wrong. It took me way longer than I had anticipated to understand the code and the environment and the use cases and the people and stuff like that. And it quickly became apparent that it was going to take a lot longer than I had thought. So, and it's funny because people that you talk to, and even people today that I talk to fairly regularly, say, "Oh, why don't you just update Puppet?" I'm like, "Well, that's a great idea." That it's just easy. Anybody on 2.7 is guilty of malpractice, but it's easy to say that when you don't know what's sitting under there. But so before I could really sort of dig in and fix things, and trust me, I really wanted to dig in and fix things. I'm not the type of person who likes to sit and ponder. I like to get things done. I had to sort of understand the environment and the use cases and the people. So that was the first step. If you were here at PuppetConf last year, how many people were at PuppetConf last year? By show of hands. Wow. All right. Yeah. So some of this will look fairly similar to what Dan Sperling talked about. He's with Getty Images. He did one of the keynotes. If you haven't seen it, it's a fantastic talk. You really should watch it. He talked about how identifying his users, and so we did sort of the same thing, and we came up with actually some similar categories. We have Puppet consumers, and those are people who use Puppet to deploy applications because they have to. If you want to deploy an application in our environment, it has to be Puppetized, and they really just want Puppet to work. There are developers who may write, modules or manifests or whatever, roles maybe, and they consume, they can consume Forge modules. And they're architects, and they sort of help shape the strategic direction of Puppet in the organization. They also sort of, manage the infrastructure and stuff like that. So, the consumers are the people who use Puppet really, they're sort of the largest constituent of our users. They don't make any changes to modules per se, just profiles really. And I use those terms kind of loosely because we haven't really enforced what a profile is. So most of our users are consumers. They don't really care about Puppet. They don't really want to learn Puppet. They just want it to work. To them, it's overhead. It's a barrier, and they're not interested in really learning about the language. So they have a very different use case than architects or developers. So we decided, they're most of our users, so we really should focus on them. And so since they're not really interested in learning it, but they have to use it, it kind of puts us in an interesting position. We decided that I think probably the interfaces are really important to these people. They want a module to work, and they want to have documentation on how to use it. They just really want to consume it. That's why we call them consumers. So we decided that the way we're going to go forward here is to write really robust primitives for application deployment. They're going to be very well documented. They're going to be stable. They're going to have a sane API, and you're just going to consume them. So you don't have to know Puppet. You just need to know how to pump some data into into your Puppet code. So that's something we're working on. But I think that's the most sane way to approach this. But so once we sort of understood what the users looked like and the use cases looked like, we decided that we needed to teach. Like I said, these people aren't really interested in learning Puppet, but they kind of need to know enough to use it. Like, if you're going to be consuming Puppet modules, you need to know what a hash is and a string and what's truthy and falsy in Puppet. So so I wrote an intro to Puppet class. Most people just didn't know it at all. They knew from watching and pattern recognition, but nobody had picked up a book or really looked through the documentation. But they had to get shit done, and that resulted in a pretty rampant propagation of bad patterns. Somebody wrote a module and it worked, and then some guy was deploying an application that looked kind of similar, and they said, "Oh, well, that's great. I'm just gonna copy and paste." And nobody thought to look and see, well, were they doing things right? So we have that's how we ended up with a lot of our code. We don't need 500,000 lines of code, I promise you that. So I wrote a 4-hour intro class, and I started teaching. I think we trained a couple hundred of the developers on it, and all of operations. The operations folks were sort of in the same position as the consumers, which was kind of surprising because they probably had the most interaction with the Puppet code. We really wanted to get everybody on like a common baseline, a foundation to build good habits on. And then we offered more advanced training for people who wanted it. We had a handful of people who wanted to know more. So that was the next step was we needed to upgrade. We realized that if we were going to be able to make any headway on changing how Puppet is used in our organization, we needed to be on something newer than 2.7.3. This is the step that took a lot. So Puppet 2.7.3 is buggy and slow. We couldn't use any Forge modules out of the box because trailing commas. I swear that just drives me nuts every time. The trailing comma is the reason I can't use anything out of the box. So Puppet 2.7 was holding us back. One of the things we realized was that we got some Puppet 3 masters set up, and we realized that it's a lot faster. We got a lot of complaints from our CD team that Puppet runs were taking 15, 20 minutes. And so we looked, and it was all plugin sync. We have thousands of plugins, and these were all new instances. So we needed to speed up plugin sync and file serving. We serve a lot of files with Puppet, a lot of small files with Puppet, which, if you know anything about the Puppet file server, that's not really ideal. So we decided to offload file serving to Puppet 3. That bit.ly link on the slide is a blog post that I wrote about it, if you're interested in how we did it. But what was really holding us back was that the code was not compatible with Puppet 3. So I have a little snippet. This is a contrived example here. This is what a lot of our code looked like. You'll see, so this is what you did before parameterized classes. You have a base class where you define your defaults. You create some variables to define your defaults. And then say you have a development environment that inherits your base class and overrides some of those values. And then an application will inherit that and override some more values. And then it'll include the class that you're trying to wrap. None of this works in 3 because dynamic scoping went away. And I had never really, I completely forgot about this pattern until I came to Constant Contact. So this, with this pattern, everything is somewhere else. It's very hard to track down what you're trying to tweak or what you're trying to do. It's very hard to troubleshoot because you're just not sure where, in this tree things are being misbehaving, and it fosters tight coupling because it has to. Like there's no other option than to be tightly coupled here. So we looked at the code and we realized it was bad. And we but we didn't really have the time or the resources to devote to redesigning it. So we just needed to refactor just enough to get to Puppet 3, and then we can take a more strategic approach to it. We needed to fix templates mostly because Ruby, we were on Ruby 1.8.7, and Ruby, I think, greater than 1.9.3 strings are no longer iterable, and that caused a lot of problems in templates. People were transparently iterating over strings. They didn't even know it, and so templates would blow up. We needed to eliminate dynamic scoping. The good thing is that the way the code was written translated really nicely into Hira. I was able to actually script a lot of it, just moving some of those values into Hira. And then the plan was to just move host to Puppet 3 as the code became compatible. For Hira, just a side note, we're using Ari's module data backend, so we can store our Hira data in our profiles. It has been an absolute lifesaver, just given the structure of our organization. Maintaining a single hierarchy for the organization just was not feasible. So now we have a private, data hierarchy for our site or our profiles. It's really great. So taking the plunge, we built out our Puppet 3 infrastructure alongside our legacy infrastructure. So that means that we have 20 Puppet masters right now, 10 for each Puppet 3 and Puppet 2.7. I've done the math. We only need 4. So yeah. We have a shared CA, so you can take a client and point it at the Puppet 3 cluster and see, hey, is this going to work? So we just, as the modules became compatible, we were going to say, hey, this application's ready and all of the dependencies are ready. We're just going to move it. That turns out that's really hard when we don't have very good node classification. Right now, nodes are defined in a site manifest. And individual classes are included at the node level. That's hard to do for 4,000 nodes, but we do it. It's very hard to determine, what can be moved over, because every node is essentially different. So we said, we just need to get this going. We're going to start with the easy stuff. And the easiest stuff that we could think of was the stuff that we managed. We didn't have to coordinate. We wrote most of the stuff so it looked better than everything else. So we started with that, and progress is helpful. So then we moved on to our CD apps because CD apps were newer and they're just easier to manage because they're easier to troubleshoot, it's easier to redeploy, stuff like that. And right now we're in process of moving our legacy applications. So you're probably curious how far along we are in this process. We've moved about half of our infrastructure over. Moving the last half is going to be easier and harder in some respects. Harder because it's going to be much harder to identify because some of these apps are living. We have Puppet 3 ready apps living on servers that also host a Puppet 2.7 app, stuff like that. So, but the good thing is that a lot of the code is already fine. So my plan is to decommission our 2.7 infrastructure in April. That will be 2 years late. That's probably going to be around the time we start provisioning our 4.0 environment, which will probably be just in time for Puppet 5. So, I talked about all this, but meanwhile, life was still happening. We couldn't stop time and do this work in a vacuum as much as we would love to. So we had to sort of develop how we were going to go forward because, we had new apps coming up and we needed new modules. We needed to use, all kinds of other stuff. So we decided to start doing things, the right way, doing things the way that we were going to do them in the future. So, our new modules live in their own repos. We have a dedicated GitHub org where all of our code lives. It's all deployed with our 10K. We've kept our Puppet 3 environment up to date. I first built out the Puppet 3 environment at 3.4.3, and we're up to 3.8.3 today. So I think that alone is impressive coming from an organization like this. When I got to Constant Contact, we didn't ever run Puppet in daemon mode. We ran it on demand, and that turns out is very infrequently. And sometimes some nodes would never get Puppet run without tags, and that's just terrible. So new modules they must be fully documented. They need tests. We're using roles and profiles, and we're using it right. But these are sort of the things that we didn't have when I started, so it made it pretty hard. There was a lot of little things, behind the scene things that needed to get fixed. So we didn't have like a CI workflow or infrastructure for Puppet code. We didn't have testing environments or harnesses or helpers. We didn't have any good standard ways to test Puppet. We had very little deployment tooling. I was really the only one who knew the testing frameworks well enough to use them. We didn't even have official, we didn't have up-to-date Vagrant images, So we had to build a lot of that stuff up from scratch. And to be honest, that was stuff that's not particularly high impact or something that's not particularly visible to the business. So I spent a lot of time on this, and people were kind of wondering what I was doing. So that's one mistake I made off the bat, is I needed to start out on some higher impact things. But this stuff needed to be done. So next steps. So these are the sort of the things we're tackling next. Node classification is at the top of my list. I just can't. We're moving towards a cloud model or a cloud native model. We're going to be doing one app per instance, and we're going to be doing containers and stuff like that. So you need to be really good at classification, which means you have to be really good at roles and profiles. We need to decouple our Puppet code both physically and logically, and that is going to be very challenging. I need to work on chipping away at this desire for bespoke everything. We need to get better at writing modules with single entry point, or the thought of a single entry point is hard to sell to people who don't really know what an entry point is, or who don't really design APIs very often. We need to get better at dependency management, and we need to use the Forge test. Right? And if you're not familiar, I think I first heard this. Gary Larissa gave a talk last year at PuppetConf, the refactor dance. It was a really good one. And he talked about the Forge test. So the Forge test, it seems to look a lot like the Puppet approved test in my mind. But it's really the definition of done. It's like, when is this module done? When can I publish it? When can I use it in production? So I have to ask, can this module be deployed to the Forge? And that means, is there any proprietary data embedded? Is it modular enough to meet unforeseen use cases? Does it have a robust suite of tests? Does it conform to the community's style expectations? Is it fully documented? And documented mean like at the very, very, very least, all public APIs are documented. So I wanted to go back and say, it's all about the interface with Puppet. That's really all Puppet is. It's writing interfaces and knowing where to make this interface available, and knowing how your users are going to interact with your Puppet code. So if you don't understand interface design, you're going to have a hard time writing good Puppet. Our module users don't care about the implementation of their modules as long as it does what it promises. They only care about the interface. So we need to make those interfaces simpler and easier to identify, easier to use, and we need to make fewer of them. So testing. We need to make testing easier. We need to make it just like super simple. People shouldn't even think about it. They should just get feedback. We need to make it automatic. We need to make it a part of the culture. and which means I need to teach people about behavior-driven development. We need to show them how much easier it is and more reliable than a handcrafted test. And eventually we need to make it required. So that's a dream of mine. So you're probably curious about some lessons that we learned. Definitely know your audience. And trying to please everybody is going to be, it means you're going to please nobody. It's always going to take longer than you think. I can't reiterate that enough. This took so much longer than I thought it would. Don't forget about the supporting infrastructure. That's going to be a lot of work too. So when you're trying to change a culture, remember it's people, process, and technology in that order. You can't expect a tool to make a significant and lasting change in the culture. And like I said, it's never gonna move as fast as you want it to. It's gonna be very frustrating for you. So just sort of be prepared for it. I wish I had known to walk and not run with this, because I had to learn the hard way that just in an enterprise this large, it's hard to get that many people to do anything. And you have to be able to convince people and get them on board. So don't let yourself become paralyzed by complexity. This is a problem that I faced. There was so much complexity, and I just didn't really know how to handle it. Getting my mind wrapped around it, so I floundered for a little bit. So take notes. I know this is stupid, but I come across multiple things daily that I want to fix, and I just have to write it down. Otherwise, I'm never going to get to it. I'm never going to remember. And then if you don't write it down, you can't prioritize it and stuff like that. So just keep a notebook. Always take the easy wins, because you're going to have a lot of harder ones. It's going to make you feel a lot better. Focus on those high-impact improvements and help as many people as you can. But those small improvements do add up, so be strategic about them. It's important to note nothing is more successful than success itself. You are going to feel a lot better about yourself when you accept those small wins, and it's going to be easier to keep chugging along. So I put this slide in later on because I essentially kind of wanted to solicit some help from the audience. Things that we haven't figured out yet. So how do we get people to feel invested in the design? How do we reinforce good behaviors? How do we make sure our massive code base is being evaluated regularly? And how and really should we hold people accountable for their Puppet code? And then how can we get operations folks, like traditional system administrators, to realize that they're software developers? It's tough. So with that, that's the end of my talk. Hopefully that's some food for thought for the questions, or maybe some people giving me some advice. So we'll take questions, but if you want to get in touch with me, this is my contact info. Feel free to ask questions or anything. So, do we have any questions? A couple over here. You're gonna get a mic.
Hey, did you use an IDE like Geppetto or something like that for your code writing?
I don't. I use Vim.
Yeah, we found that our code quality really went up. We did a very similar thing, not on the scale that you have, and we found that it really helped us a lot.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
So yeah.
Just the active syntax checking and stuff like that.
Yeah, and also we had like custom functions and things like that we wrote and documented, and when you like mouse over them, it will pop up the doco and be like, oh, that's what this is and who wrote it. And it works for all the Puppet modules as well, so you import the whole lot, even the Puppet supported ones.
Okay.
But yeah, that's something we found really useful.
Thank you. I'll keep that in mind. Although I'm not sure I want to fight IDE wars with my developers, but I'll who else has a question here? Right here.
Hi, I was just wondering if you had experimented at all with using Puppet lint for quality control. Was it a positive experience, or did it not work out well for you?
Yeah, so we, on our newer modules, we run, along with your testing suite, we have a standard set of Puppet lint configurations. We use the Puppet syntax gem, and there's another one. Anyway, yeah, you have to be careful though. Don't be too pedantic. The hard part is being opinionated without being pedantic, right? So be judicious on what you let make fail. So two space tabs, I'm not going to set that to fail. It's just not, But maybe something like double quoting variables or brackets in variables, in interpolated variables. Yeah, that's something I'm going to fail on. And eventually, I want to say, you don't have documentation. We're going to fail your build. So.
Hello.
Hi.
The company I work for, we're trying hard to socialize Puppet in a way that engages operations, the development team, and even admins who may be reluctant to use it because they see it as sort of encroaching on what they do when we're trying to get them to do it differently. But one concern I have is sort of following the same sort of path that you inherited. And what are your thoughts on like the benevolent dictator approach, where you're the gatekeeper to getting things approved and merged, and if it doesn't go by you, it doesn't go. And would that be the motivation to get them to focus more on quality?
Yeah, that's probably not going to work. Whoever you put in charge for that is going to have a terrible, terrible time with that. And in the end, people are very creative at getting around stuff like that. I think that the better approach is to convince people. It's the harder approach, definitely, because if I had my way, this would be done. But it's just not going to be sustainable. There is an art to making people think that something was their idea. Some people call it manipulation. Other people call it diplomacy or charisma. Maybe that's going to be a part of it. There are some things that I definitely have strong opinions about, and I will. But the key is listening to what people feel, and you have to make sure that you listen to their objections. And if in the end, you just have to get really good at making them not upset about you overriding them, I guess. I mean, and using it very, very, very judiciously. So. Sorry.
Do you implement code tests? And if not, do you implement code tests? And if not, do you have plans in one direction or another for testing?
For like new hires?
No, just when I write a module testing, that there's enough code coverage for.
Oh, code coverage. Yeah. Oh, I would love that. Yeah. I use code coverage as sort of a personal metric. But I'm not sure that we're ready to enforce code coverage, mostly because people don't really understand code coverage with Puppet. So, that's going to be pretty hard. But it's something that I do for myself. But we'd have a lot of work to get to that point. But yeah.
So I think we have time for one more question. Or 0 more questions, if nobody has them.
I answered all of the world's problems here. Oh, we got one over there. Here we go.
Your CI integration work that you might have done already?
My CI
CI integration?
Yeah. So he's asking just to talk about how we do CI. It's actually really, we have GitHub Enterprise and we have Jenkins, and we use the GitHub webhooks. So you submit a pull request, and Jenkins will spin up a container. It'll test according to a matrix. We test for every Ruby version and every Puppet version in our environment. And then you get a little green check mark on your pull request, and somebody reviews it and merges it. And then continuous delivery is done with R10K. So Is that what you were looking for? Did you want something a little more in-depth? Cool. You have somebody back here?
Just a quick question. What is your plan for your node classification for the future?
My sales rep up here is very happy about this question. I think we're going to use, so we own a lot of licenses for Puppet Enterprise, but we don't use it. So I think we're going to use the node manager. And I'm not talking about the GUI. We are going to use, there's a Puppet module that the PSE folks use to define node, host groups. We're going to be doing that. So. Cool.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, David. That was fantastic.
Thank you.